Hello and welcome to October in Royals, Rebels, and Romantics Land. We have such fun episodes this month, and also we're starting something new. I call it What's Past is Prologue, and it's the part of my business where I'm really looking at using history to help us learn what's possible today. So we'll be looking at some characters, some events, some traditions of history, and really exploring those in some special episodes each month. I hope you enjoy. Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics that I'm calling What's Past is Prologue, where I do sort of a deep dive into how history shows us what's possible and how we can put some of the lessons of history to work for us today. Now, some of you know that over the last few months, I've spent quite a bit of time traveling, which means I've spent quite a bit of time on airplanes. Sometimes this is great. It's fun to be in the airport, sort of, and flying, taking off. Don't really love it. But I've been able to do some wonderful things. I've taken 3 Smithsonian journeys this year, and I've been able to visit my family, which is my very favorite thing. And sometimes that means I'm on airplanes thinking I'm going to read, I'm going to work, and facing an 8-hour flight. Honestly, sometimes I think I have to watch a movie. So I've watched some movies that are maybe older movies that I haven't seen for a while that I enjoy. And one of the ones I watched recently was Glass Onion, which is part of that Knives Out murder mystery series featuring Benoit Blanc. And in this case, he is trying to figure out the mystery surrounding Miles Bron. And as he is figuring out this mystery and why things don't seem quite right and what's really going on, he realizes and explains that the problem is Miles Bron is not who he appears to be. He is not a brilliant disruptor who's invented all kinds of things, because his conversation is full of, according to Benoit Blanc, it's a minefield of malapropisms. Oh, that was such a great description, a minefield of malapropisms. And it is what those malapropisms that clued in the famous detective to what was wrong, to what wasn't really true. It allowed him to, taking up a theme of the movie, peel back the layers. So what's a malapropism? What's that all about? And why is that such a key element in the movie? A malapropism is when a word that we use sounds like a real word or sounds like the right word, but really isn't. So I looked it up, found a few examples on my friend Google. They danced the flamingo instead of flamenco. The guilty man looked for an escaped goat to blame rather than scapegoat. For all intensive purposes, our work here is done. For all intents and purposes. Or, and this one is used quite a bit on purpose now, I resemble that remark. And I know some people use it on purpose now, but initially it was meant to be, I resent that remark. Now, one of the really common thoughts about malapropisms is that the name comes, or the term comes, from a famous character in Richard Sheridan's play, The Rivals, Mrs. Malaprop. She is a character who frequently misuses words, and I have a few to share with you. She talks about the pineapple of politeness instead of the pinnacle of politeness. She describes someone as headstrong as an allegory on the banks of the Nile instead of alligator. He can tell you all the perpendiculars of the situation instead of particulars. You need to alliterate him from your memory. Obliterate. He will dissolve my mystery. Resolve. I have since laid Sir Anthony's preposition before him. Proposition. I'm sorry to say, sir, that my affluence over my niece is very small. Influence. And finally, and I love this one, I am sure I have done everything in my power ever since I exploded the affair. Meaning exposed, but I love the idea of exploding an affair. So it's easy to associate these malapropisms with Mrs. Malaprop and think that the term actually comes from the character name. But in fact, it's really the other way around. According to the OED, the Old English Dictionary, a very reliable source, the term comes from the French mal à propos, meaning ill suited. And it was first recorded in English in 1630, more than 100 years before Sheridan's play, which came out in 1775. So, in fact, Sheridan named his character after the term. Now, the frequency of her misusing words really makes her the perfect mascot for malapropisms, even though the term doesn't originate with her. But that tactic in literature goes back much further than Sheridan's play. In fact, one of my favorite characters whose language is full of comments like that is Dogberry in Shakespeare's play, Much Ado About Nothing. Now, in that play, we get caught up in the love story of Beatrice and Benedict and how they are sort of tricked into loving each other. But under that, there is this very negative theme of Don John and his companions tricking the prince and Claudio into believing the very worst slander about the character of Hero. And in fact, when they slander Hero and the prince and Claudio believe it like that, they call her out on the day of her potential wedding and she is left for dead. It's a very dark theme kind of running through that play. But the people perpetuating that idea or perpetrating that on Hero and trying to destroy her reputation are actually caught by Dogberry, the local watch, who's one of the most ridiculous characters in Shakespeare and certainly in this play. So I want to share some of the malapropisms that he uses. And so you can see how this language is misused. And Shakespeare uses that to get us back in the idea of comedy, even though this is dealing with the darker side of the play. So Dogberry, who's all puffed up and thinks he's quite serious and a great captain of the watch, he says that he has identified some auspicious characters, meaning suspicious. And when others sort of question, what are you talking about? What's wrong with these guys? He gets very offended because he's so important and says, dost thou not suspect my place in the community? Dost thou not suspect my years of service? Of course, he means to be saying respect, but he's trying to appear, as the character in The Glass Onion is trying to appear, more intelligent than he actually is. He's trying to use language to make a point, and in fact, the language he uses sort of deflates his point. He explains going on as he's delivering his report. Our watch, my lord, have indeed comprehended these auspicious persons. Well, comprehended rather than apprehended is particularly funny because he not only comprehended, but he does not comprehend. So we sort of taken comprehend, turned it into comprehend. He means apprehend. All of this is being done very deliberately by Shakespeare to play the comedy, but also to tell us, if we haven't picked it up yet, something about Dogberry and how he is trying to appear to be more than he is. Now, Shakespeare also uses this in a really clever way that tugs at all kinds of meaning within his own audience. We would often miss this today. One example is when he says, "Oh, villain," when he's addressing one of these auspicious or suspicious characters, thou wilt be condemned into everlasting redemption for this. Now, of course, he means everlasting damnation because he's accusing him of something bad. But the idea of being condemned to everlasting damnation was front of mind during the 1590s when Shakespeare is writing in the early 1600s, because with all of the religious upheaval going on, people were very concerned about what they believed, what Catholics believed, what members of the New Anglican, the Elizabethan Anglican Church believed. And that notion of everlasting damnation was something that was very timely and appropriate. We might not think of that, but they did in his audience. Of course, that's who Shakespeare's writing for. And then later, he talks about the recording the excommunication rather than the communication. Again, Elizabeth I was excommunicated. Catholics in England who support Elizabeth I are being threatened with excommunication. That term is heavy laden. So although it's funny because Dogberry means communication, it's also a little shivery in Shakespeare's time. There's another layer there. Shakespeare is using that language to really get his characters saying things that make the audience think. It's funny, but it also raises some questions, and that's the sign of using great language. Now, if we go back to the glass onion, Miles Bron is doing much the same. He is not brilliant, but he is presenting himself as the originator of all of these ideas to convince his friends to continue to invest in all of his ideas. And he's doing so by making up words that sound like they could be a real word, but they're not really a real word. One time he says, we need to embreathiate. Well, that kind of sounds like, well, the word breathe is in there and embreathiate. No, not a real word. Or he uses words like reclamation, but he doesn't use them in the right way. So basically, he is using language that sounds good. He's using language to impress people in the same way that Dogberry does. Dogberry is trying to appear more confident and more successful than he is. Miles Bron, hundreds of years later, is doing the same thing. And they're doing it, these created characters are doing it with malapropisms. In other words, using language and twisting it, using incorrect language in a way that helps us laugh. We laugh at Mrs. Malaprop with her pineapple instead of pinnacle of success. We laugh at Dogberry. We laugh at Miles Bron once Benoit Blanc has pointed it out to us. And these are being used for laughs. They're very cleverly used by the creators of these fictional characters, from Shakespeare to Sheridan, right up to the present time. But what can we learn from that? Are there times when public figures today use words incorrectly, use words in a way that might tell us something about them that is not what they intended? I have found a few examples from the last few years. I'm going to identify the speaker in some cases and not in others. But we are going to see how some celebrities and public figures have used language in this way. For example, Mike Tyson, after losing a match, said, I might just fade into Bolivian. Of course, he's going for oblivion. He's not talking about moving to Bolivia. Justin Bieber, quite well known among some parts of the world out there, when he was being questioned about some of the images and some of what he was going for, got it a little wrong and said, I'm not going for the 16th Chapel look. Of course, what he was really trying to say was Sistine Chapel. Mike Smith, a baseball player, was talking about how great his coat was, how warm it was, because it had, quote, a lot of installation in it. insulation is what he was asking. Charles Shackelford of the MBA, and I really like this one. I can dribble with my right hand. I can dribble with my left hand. I guess that makes me amphibious. Well, it actually makes him ambidextrous. We have Yogi Berra of baseball fame, and there are quite a few yogiisms. I'll share just a few. One of the things he said was to take it all with a grin of salt. Now, when we take something with a grain of salt, we often end up grinning. So that does seem appropriate, but not quite right. He mentioned that not winning is guttering. I guess he meant gut wrenching by that. And other kinds of wordplay where Yogi is saying something, but it's not quite right. When you come to a fork in the road, take it and pair up in threes. Some things you have to think about. 90% of the game is half mental. And finally, one of my favorites, I never said most of the things I said. Now, you can imagine Yogi saying that. And most of these things are not really harmful. Certainly, Yogi saying things like that about baseball being 90% half mental, but they can get a little strange. Now, I want to mention one final, really fun and actually endearing example from a fairly recent movie for young people, Finding Dory, after all of the success and fame of Finding Nemo. So you see Dory as a young fish, and she is sort of role playing with her parents, trying to explain what makes her different from other young fish, which is, some memory problems. And the way she explains it is, I suffer from short remembering loss. Now, it's short-term memory loss, but she gets close, but not quite. It's endearing and lovely and gives us a little chuckle as little Dory is trying to express what's happening. And it's genuine in her part. It's funny when a baseball player says it. But sometimes when people who might have a little more influence on what's happening in the world misuse language in this way, and it doesn't seem intentional. In Shakespeare, it's intentional. In The Glass Onion, it's intentional. In Finding Dory, that's fiction. It's intentional and endearing. And sometimes it's just funny. It doesn't really matter what Yogi Berra. But sometimes it might have a little more oomph or a little more lasting effect, or at least cause some concerns. For example, when George W. Bush said, "We cannot let terrorists or rogue nations hold this nation hostile." Now, of course, he means hold it hostage, but that underlying hostile can make you turn your head a little. These are a little bit more funny. Richard J. Daley said of O'Hare Airport, "It is the crosswords of the nation," meaning crossroads. This comment, and right now with the flooding that's going on with the hurricane, sounds a little more poignant. But he said, and this was years ago, he was talking about flood damage many years ago. The flood damage was so bad, they had to evaporate the city, meaning evacuate. And a Texas politician, Gib Lewis, said, "This is unparalleled in the state's history," meaning, of course, unparalleled. Now, I found a few more phrases that I'm not going to actually say who said them because they can be a little more problematic or maybe cause a little more wondering which public figures, people who have some power and authority in the world. I will answer those alligators in my own time. For allegations, maybe just a misstep, they need to repudiate those remarks. Refuse? Repudiate? Not quite sure, because repudiate is not a word. They have misunderestimated me. Misunderstood? Underestimated? Not quite sure. We'll let our friends be the peacekeepers and we'll be the pacemakers. Probably means peacemakers. And finally, this policy is unprecedented, as in President Ed, instead of unprecedented. So what's the point of talking about all of this? When errors in language are intentional, like they are in Sheridan's The Rivals or Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, when they are intentional, they can make us laugh. And they're intended to make us laugh. We find humor in characters who are attempting to appear more intelligent or more in charge or more hip and knowing what they're doing than they really are. We find it funny to hear language misused like that. In the case of the glass onion, we see an example where someone's consistent misuse of language, someone who consistently displays he does not understand what these words mean, in fact, lead the great detective Benoit Blanc to realize he is trying to appear to be something he is not. He is trying to manipulate and fool people into doing something they might not do if they realized who the real Miles Bron is. So we can see the impact of deliberate manipulation. Experts say that the way we use language does have an impact on how we interact with people and how they respond to and feel about us. Sometimes we see these errors in language, maybe from just misspeaking or making a simple mistake, even from laziness, sort of making up a word rather than figuring out the correct word to use. Sometimes we see language misused because people are trying to impress an audience rather than express an idea. They are borrowing words that they don't really understand because they want to sort of dazzle you with the glitz so that you don't realize that there's really nothing of substance beneath. Now, when it's being done by Dogberry, who has accidentally captured some real malefactors, not benefactors, as he calls them, that can be very funny. It's done intentionally, it's fictional, it is set up to make us laugh. And so his misuse of language is funny and does give us that message. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. Therefore, he can't be trusted to really examine these particular people he's arrested and find out the truth because he doesn't know what these words mean. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He is unlikely to know what they are talking about. This is in a comedy play. It's fine that that's going on. We get a chuckle out of it. But can imprecise language, if we use it or others use it unintentionally, if we are trying to borrow words that sound fancy and sound impressive because we're trying to impress an audience rather than express an idea, can those kinds of mistakes work against us in the same way they work against Dogberry and in the same way they work against Miles Bron? Language displays the truth. It reveals the truth. It exposes the truth. When we use it well and carefully and intentionally, when we use it to express an idea, it can be one of the greatest tools that we have. But when we are careless or when we are attempting to be manipulative and borrow or misuse language when we don't really know what it means, but boy, it sounds good, and it will probably impress all those people listening to us, it can, in fact, reveal unintended messages about us. A minefield of malapropisms is what led to the discovery that Miles Bron in The Glass Onion was not who he was trying to appear to be. And misusing language can do the same for us. So, as we think about what history shows us is possible, one of the things that is possible is to sometimes use language in fun, engaging, humorous ways intentionally, and to use language in a very clear and straightforward way to express an idea. But always beware if you are using language to impress people, because that makes you vulnerable to the kind of errors that we see made over hundreds of years when people are trying to appear more knowledgeable, more confident, more prepared than they really are by borrowing language that is not really appropriate to the level where they should be speaking. Instead, let's all use the best, clearest, most concise, and straightforward language we can. Language is powerful, and history shows us that what's possible is powerful, clear communication. So when you're using language, just remember it can be tempting to be the pineapple of success, but instead, let's be as clear and straightforward as possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. And can I please ask a favor? We could really use your help spreading the word about the podcast. If you could share with a friend, leave a rating, leave some comments, I would really appreciate it. And also, maybe you'd consider becoming a patron. A big shout out and thank you to all of my patrons. You make our work possible. Thanks for listening, and hope you keep looking around and seeing how history shows us what's possible.